Okay, good evening, everyone. We're back with our NGO social sector series. Last time we spoke about how you should actually go about setting up an NGO, and what your options are. Whether you should go with a trust or with a Section 8 or with a society, or perhaps you should be asking yourself the right questions before you actually figure out which sort of entity type you actually need to go for. This week we'll be tackling something that is probably a little more, I think it's a burning question for a lot of NGOs, especially a lot of NGOs that have reached out to us before, in the past, as well as post the last WEP call, in terms of funding compliances, and of course, what are the best sort of ways to keep their books in order, what are the accounting systems they should follow, and so on and so forth. So when you look at funding compliances, that world is very, very large. I mean, essentially we talk about 12AA, ATG, and also FCRA regulations. Because there is so much information out there, we've decided this time to actually create a small presentation for you. I will be switching on the presentation and sharing my screen now, and of course, as we go on, I will be explaining, what is actually mentioned on these slides. Um, so today we'll be, talking about the funding scene for NGOs. Like I mentioned before, so we'll try and essentially give you a brief idea about what's going on in the country. Especially if you're new to the sector, you might find this information useful. We'll of course be suggesting how you can actually get your registrations right, in terms of key certifications for 12A, ATG, and FCRA, and then we'll be talking about the basic accounting nuances and compliances for NGOs. Now, coming to the funding scene, I'm sure all of you are really curious to know broadly where the money actually comes from. So I think, essentially, what we really want to establish here is that the government is still, the supreme sort of funds provider for the NGO sector. Government funding over here includes central and state spending, and private sector funding includes CSR funds, individual philanthropy, and of course, foreign donations. Now, when you actually see the breakdown, you see that the central government is providing 2.1 lakh crores, but the state governments collectively provide so much more in terms of the NGO funding. This is close to 8 lakh crores a year. Totally this adds up to about 6% of the GDP. On the private side, the total funding is about 70,000 crores, and the CSR funds account for around 13,000 crores. Foreign funding accounts for about 14,000 crores, and individual philanthropy accounts for 43,000 crores. Now, a major portion of individual philanthropic funds actually come from Mr. Azim Premji's donation, which he has given to the Azim Premji Philanthropic Initiatives organization. If you actually take that aside, then individual philanthropy has actually seen a marginal decrease of 4% between 2014 and 2018. Um, Now, CSR funds, which like I mentioned is about 13,000 crores, has actually seen both the rate of growth as well as the utilization rates go up. So utilization rates as of 2018 were about 85%, but that basically means that 15% of CSR funds are still unutilized, and this may have then led to the government, releasing the order that maybe non-usage or non-usage of CSR funds will be deemed as a criminal activity. Of course, they have to roll back on that, but you can see why the government may have thought of passing an order like that. Um, Another interesting aspect, that we feel, apart from many of the other standard things, or policies or decisions the NGOs take in terms of raising funds. It could be sending direct emailers, or face-to-face interactions, or online solicitations, and so on and so forth. Most of the established NGOs may in fact already know this, but getting yourself empaneled is actually very useful. So you could actually get yourself empaneled with the larger organizations such as the Azim Premji Philanthropic Initiatives, or even the National CSR Hub at Tata Institute of Social Sciences. This will in fact help you, possibly, or open up a world of CSR funds for you. Now, coming to the actual compliances, the world of compliances, especially related to NGOs, has seen, seems to be a real work in progress at the moment. There were a lot of announcements in the finance bill, in the finance minister's budget speech, and then finally, a lot of these announcements then became part of an act, the Finance Act 2020, and I think it's better to delve into what is actually happening with 12AA, ATG, and FCRA. So if you see, with 12AA, to attract any sort of funding, right, you need to be registered actually under 12AA. Now, what has happened, or one of the biggest changes that has happened, through the Finance Bill 2020, is that essentially 12AA has got replaced by Section 12AB. Now, what does 12AA or 12AB essentially do? Well, if you have a 12AA for now and 12AB registration, when 12AB actually becomes effective, it was supposed to be effective from 1st June, but because of COVID, that has got postponed to 1st October. And of course, we are expecting that on account of COVID, there could be further delays. So as of now, we are still dealing with 12AA. Essentially, once you register under 12AA, you are eligible for tax exemptions under Section 11 of the Income Tax Act. So, essentially, once you get your 12AA, you can go ahead and get an ATG certification done as well. An ATG registration or certificate essentially allows you, allows the people who donate to you to get, tax-free or a tax exemption on the amount that they have given to you. Now, before we delve into the major changes, let us understand why some of these changes have been announced, in terms of, why 12AA has been replaced by 12AB, or why there have been even changes announced in the ATG registration. So, earlier we had a lot of arbitration building up in the country because typically, assessing officers would deny, to grant 12AA registrations to new NGOs, as their spending in the initial years, could not prove their charitable objectives. But eventually the judiciary would uphold the fact that the NGO deserved to get the 12AA registration. So on the basis of the fact that they did not have enough time to do the charitable activities once they sort of went live or got the registration. So they still deserve to get the 12AA exemption, because as per their objectives, they are looking to do charitable activities. But then this was actually leading to a lot of unnecessary burden on the judicial system. The second thing, I think more broadly speaking, and without really getting into the specifics, we do know, on a general basis, that NGOs who have got 12AA and ATG certificates in the past were not really being held accountable once they got them. So in some cases, the registrations would be cancelled or revoked, but a majority of the, immoral NGOs got away with it. So they weren't actually, very clearly undertaking charitable objectives, or the activities were not really matching their objectives on paper. So there had to be some sort of checks and balances in place. Of course, I think another element would also be that now that we have 12AB and ATG, and obviously the provisions of these I will be announcing, or talking about in a bit. But you will see that because these registrations have a 5-year limit essentially, and you need to then keep applying for the same registration every 5 years. It would to some extent provide an additional revenue and therefore add to the government's kitty. So I think looking at all these sort of scenarios, the government thought of updating the provisions regarding tax exemptions for NGOs. Now, if let's start with 12AA, right? So firstly, 12AA has now got replaced with 12AB, like I suggested earlier. And now, the interesting part is that NGOs willing to make fresh applications can get a provisional registration. So if you look, if you link that to what we said about the judiciary being unnecessarily burdened, now NGOs can get a provisional registration for 3 years, and they need to basically apply for a full 5-year registration. Within 2.5 years of actually getting that registration. Now, in fact, the older NGOs which already have a 12AA registration will in fact have to apply for a 12AB registration. Now, earlier this due date was 31st August. This due date was actually 3 months within, when the new act was supposed to become effective, as far as 12AB and the new regulations around ATG were to be effective from 1st June, and you had to get your registration done under 12AB within 3 months. So the deadline was 31st August. Now these regulations will be effective 1st October. So you will have to get this done anytime within 3 months of 1st October. So I would guess anytime between 1st October and 31st December. Now, once these registrations are approved, the interesting part is that they are not on a perpetual basis. So going back to the other point that we made, that earlier, once you got your 12AA and ATG registration, you could then just sit on these registrations, and unless you did something categorically wrong and your license or your registration was revoked or cancelled, in this case now with with Section 12AB, you will actually have to renew these licenses, renew this registration every 5 years. And that would then require paperwork, but it would also, allow the assessing officer to have checks and balances in place, to make sure that your objectives and your activities are in sync. Now, as far as new NGOs are concerned, or NGOs that have not been, in action for 3 years, they are relatively new. Effectively, registrations now for 12AB can happen under 4 categories. The category C is the interesting one, because category C is basically for the new NGOs that can get a provisional registration. Now, the steps for registration are the same. So if for most of you who may already know this, when you have applied for a 12AA in the past and now you will apply for a 12AB, you essentially need to submit a Form 10A. And along with it, you need to submit, supporting documents such as your incorporation documents, your MOA or trust deed, your annual accounts, and of course, previous approval, or rejection reason. Now, moving on to, I think another thing we need to cover here is that earlier, as some of you may know, one could get a tax exemption, under 12AA and Section 1023 simultaneously, which essentially meant that you could apply Section 1023 to also get a tax exemption, and if for any reason that was cancelled, you could still go ahead and use your 12AA registration and then get exemption under Section 11 of the Income Tax Act. But now both these sections have become mutually exclusive, which means that if you choose to go for a 1023 exemption, you cannot choose to go for a Section 11 exemption under 12AB, or if you choose to go for a 12AB registration, you cannot get exemption under 1023. Essentially, so this again will help a lot of, I think the assessing officers and essentially the tax department keep a tab on, the link between what the stated objectives are and what the NGO is actually doing. Now coming, to ATG. Now, the amendment in the finance bill, like I have mentioned multiple times already, is also applicable for ATG registrations. So, what is ATG? I think, as most of you know, ATG is essentially an incentive to donors, who donate to your NGO, as it essentially allows them deductions on the income tax liability. So, we need to have a 12AA registration, or now going forward a 12AB registration, as a prerequisite to apply for an ATG certificate or a registration. So once again, with the finance bill amendment, all the older charitable institutions that already had an ATG certificate will then need to apply for a fresh one. And again, this certificate will only be valid for 5 years. And once again, new NGOs can get a provisional ATG certificate. Um, I think the interesting thing to note here, both for 12AA, or in this case 12AB and ATG, as far as new NGOs are concerned, if you are a new NGO who is looking to go, who's looking to get registered and then get a provisional registration done, do note that you can't get the registration done for financial year 2021. Effectively, you will need to get this registration now done, or when I say registration, I mean the 12AB registration and the ATG registration for financial year 21-22. Right? So, I mean, this financial year is out for you in any case. Now, again, the steps for getting the ATG, certification, again, are fairly simple. I'll just quickly go through that slide. You again need to submit your Form 10B, submit your supporting documents. Someone will verify, these documents, the tax officer will, and then your ATG certificate will get issued. Now, one more thing I want to actually mention over here is, and this is the new regulation that has come, with the finance bill this year, is that the finance minister has clearly said this in the budget speech, and this is something that anyone who's going for an ATG certification needs to be well aware of. That that every time that you take a donation, you need to basically now submit a form that effectively says that I have got this amount of money from this person, and what the tax department is essentially wanting you to do is then link it directly with the donor's income tax returns, so that the tax exemptions automatically show up, when they are filing their returns. So, this will again, what we spoke about in terms of, the checks and balances in place, and making sure that if someone is actually giving these funds, then they get the, the tax exemption for it. And the NGO is then declaring that, yeah, this person has actually given so and so amount of money, and, this is the person's PAN, and so on and so forth. Now, the donee is also required to generate a certificate on the basis of which the donor can claim the Chapter 6A deductions. This is sort of a bit like, doing the TDS filings and the TDS returns. Effectively, all these NGOs will now have to, furnish a return stating what I have already mentioned before. Now, we had a lot of questions last time around in terms of, charitable objectives, and if an NGO that is running and doing some type of business activity, if they go for a 12AA registration, or now a 12AB registration, or an ATG certification, will there be any problems? I think a lot of them came up to us and said that a lot of people are telling us that only 20% of our receipts for the year, or income for the year, can actually come from business income, and the balance 80% actually needs to come from donations, and so on and so forth. I think what we really need to look at over here is that the answer actually lies in Section 215 of the Income Tax Act, because when an assessing officer is actually looking at your case, he is going to refer or match your objectives to what is actually mentioned in Section 215 of the Income Tax Act. So when you get your 12AB registration and your ATG certificate, and when you go to get a tax exemption, while filing your taxes, your assessing officer will basically look at section 215 of the ITA, and then he's going to see whether your stated objectives actually fit in vis-a-vis the definitions that are given in 215. Now, the definitions that are given in 215 are actually laid out over here. Relief to the poor, education, yoga, medical relief, environmental preservation, monument preservation, and of course, anything that doesn't fit into any of these 6 categories will go into advancement of any other object of general public utility, right? So, beyond that, I think the AO will also look at the activities that you've already carried out. So what the AO will then do is take all 3 into consideration, and he will determine whether any commercial activity that you're undertaking is actually going towards furthering the objectives in section 250 of the ITA. So if you carry out an activity which is explicitly stated in definition of charitable purpose, then you are a charitable organization, irrespective of the fact whether you incidentally generate profits or not. The problem will actually arise when your object fails in the residuary ambit of advancement of any other object of general public utility. I'm reading out here, as you can make out, because I need to very clearly state these points that I'm making. This regulation is the result of the definition being inclusive and more likely to be manipulated on account of tax planning. So basically, a lot of people have manipulated this definition in the past. This definition itself was very limited, and in fact, things like yoga were just added in the year 2015. So the idea here is that the AO will look at what your objectives are stated in your MOA or in your trust deed. He will look at what the objectives are stated in section 215, and he will look at the activities that you've undertaken as an NGO. He will look at all 3 and then tell you whether you are getting that tax exemption or not, essentially, right? Or whether you need to follow the 80-20 rule, which is that your income from business activities has to be limited to 20%. So I'm going to try and explain this through a very simple example. Let's say you run a school, right, and it's registered as a charitable trust, and you run the school by taking fees from the children. You even pay staff to the you even pay salaries to the staff. You will pay expenses for the school infrastructure, but you end up making a surplus at the end of the year. Now, you can still get a tax exemption because your objectives stated in your trust deed say that you are an NGO, or you are running this NGO because you want to further the cause of education. And section 215 explicitly also states that education is a charitable objective. So here, even if you end up making a surplus, you can still get a tax exemption. But let's say, on the contrary, that you are running another charitable trust, and this time your charitable trust is addressing the issue of gender inequality, by giving income opportunities to women. Now, to do this, you get cloth bags made by these women and sell these commercially. Now, if your trust deed actually states that you're working towards helping women, the AO is going to link this objective to the advancement of any other objective of general public utility, which is this aspect, right? And in this case, only 20% of your total receipts from the year can come from the sale of bags, right? So now you see that how this limitation is actually applied. Now, again, there are a lot of clauses that we possibly can't cover, because each and every NGO situation is unique, and that's why the team will be posting over here a form that you can fill up to schedule 15-minute one-on-one sessions with us, with our CA, so that we can actually guide you on whether your NGO should go for a 12AB registration or an ATG registration, and will it impact your ability to carry out any type of business activity going forward. So I really hope this small example clears the doubts for a lot of people out there. For all the people who came to us last year, I do want to mention that there is no black and white answer. There are a lot of gray areas as far as the tax implications go. Now, what we have done is that in this case, we have only taken what your stated objectives are and matched it with what the charitable objectives are mentioned, under Section 215 of the Income Tax Act. But there are many other points that you need to consider, which frankly, we are not in a position to probably cover today. These are related to how you make your expenses. So right now we are only talking about how you make your, you get the receipts or you get the income. But, there is also an 85-15 rule where 85% of your expenses should be going towards charitable objectives. And if they are not going towards charitable objectives, then there are certain provisions that you need to undertake to ensure that the money is used up within 1 to 5 years, or so on and so forth. So there are a lot of permutation combinations essentially, and that's why we have recommended that you sign up for these 15-minute one-on-one sessions, so that we can get total clarity in terms of what is exactly coming into your NGO, how the money is going out, and therefore how a 12 AB or an ATG registration will actually impact you going forward. Now, coming to foreign funding, essentially, I think a lot of people know this. I think it's been coming in the papers. There has been, a significant crackdown by the government. It has cancelled 13,000 NGO registrations for violations of FCRA regulations in the past 3 years. And I think we should be prepared for continued stringent measures, as far as FCA funding goes. Now, even though majority of our NGO funding actually comes from the government, as we mentioned, 10 lakh crores is basically from the central and state government. Foreign funding is about 14,000 crores. This is not a small amount, so it has to be regulated. Now, in order to receive foreign donations, you have to register for an FCRA, and essentially, your FCRA procedures are quite complicated, but essentially, to get an FCRA registration, you should have been in existence for at least 3 years, and you should have spent at least 10 lakhs on your charitable activities, right? So does that mean that, again, if you are a new NGO and you are getting foreign funding, you can't possibly get it because you don't qualify for an FCRA registration? No. Essentially, if you are, a newly registered entity, you can get foreign funds of a specific amount from a specific donor for a specific purpose or activity if you go through the FCRA prior permissions route, right? Now, in the prior permissions route as well, you can basically, again, you have to go and apply for it. Now, another thing that has happened, interestingly, and this regulation came out in 2014, is that, sorry, not 2014, 2017, is that, all the registered, all the NGOs that were registered under FCRA or seeking a registration or a prior permission had to register themselves on the Darpan portal of the Niti Aayog. Right, and we again had a lot of questions surrounding this in terms of how we can go ahead and register our NGO on the Darpan portal, last week as well. I think as we go forward in the presentation, we'll show you that it's basically a 5 or 6 step process, and it's fairly simple. Now, once you register, on the Darpan portal, you get a Darpan identification number, which is basically for all FCRA related activities, whether it is for registration, prior permissions, renewal, changing of details, uploading of annual returns, and so on and so forth. So basically, you need to get this Darpan identification number. Now, very quickly, let me, just spell out what the steps are to get your FCRA registration. Most of these, you need to go step by step. Again, the world of FCRA itself has a lot of, regulations in terms of, are you receiving donations in kind? Are you receiving donations less than 1 lakh? And so on and so forth. And for any of these questions, please feel free to schedule a 15-minute one-on-one call with us so that we can take these exact details from you and then give you the correct advice. Now, as far as registration on the Darpan portal is concerned, we've tried to lay out the steps over here. If anyone has faced any issues, I think you need to take this up directly with the Niti Aayog. And of course, if you need any handholding on this regard, we'll of course be happy to help you in terms of trying to help you gather your details and so on and so forth. So the steps are fairly simple. You need to go ahead, go on the NGO Darpan portal, create a user ID password. You need to fill in your details, your registration details, let them know whether you have multiple registrations, what are the issues that you're working on, the geographical areas that you're working on, as well as the sector, and of course fill in your other NGO related details and then submit this. And so the steps are fairly simple, and you should be able to finish this in one sitting. Now, we've spoken about compliances pertaining to funding in terms of your 12AB registration, in terms of your ATG registration, and and also in terms of the FCRA regulations. But I think another very important aspect that we need to cover is perhaps accounting systems. Now, again, accounting systems, just like the 85-15 rule as far as expenses go, is something that is a world in its own on its own. So we are looking to cover this more in depth in our next session. 2 weeks from now. So I think that's about I think the 19th of June. I think another really important aspect of getting your funding is your accounting systems. Typically, if you are a pure play charitable institute, you can actually adopt any accounting methodology. However, if you're a Section 8, you of course need to follow the accrual system of accounting because that's mandated by the Companies Act. If you are not a Section 8, and let's say you're a trust or a society, but you have some semblance of commercial activity going on in your NGO, then you have to adopt the Indian accounting standards. If you adopt the Indian accounting standards, essentially, the Indian accounting standards stipulates that you need to get your accounting done on an accrual basis. But I think the larger issue here, which where a lot of NGOs possibly face problems, is the issue of accountability, and actually having that accountability with your donors or with the people who are actually providing you these grants and funds. To tackle that, essentially, our understanding is that a lot of good NGOs follow a fund-based accounting system. And again, this is going to be covered more in depth in our next session on the 19th of June, where we'll talk about, restricted funds or unrestricted funds, and or, grants that you receive in kind, donations that you receive in kind, and how we can actually account for these, in a manner where we can actually link milestones, to the funds that we have received. And I think this again is a significant topic on its own. I think we also had a lot of questions regarding annual compliances. What we had covered in our session last week as well, that usually public trusts don't have too many annual compliances. Societies have minimal annual compliances, and of course Section 8 companies have many annual compliances, but that also leads to a greater amount of credibility. Now, some of the standard compliances which are there for all companies, and it's no different for Section 8 companies, are things like appointment of an auditor, or filing your returns, filing your financial statements with the ROC, and so on and so forth. These all need to be covered by the Section 8 company, and this of course adds to greater credibility, because the more information you give about yourselves, essentially the better your donors will feel in terms of how you have actually utilized these funds, and so on and so forth. I think with that, we are mostly done with today's session. I think we'll be open for more Q&A, and of course we will be covering a lot of questions about fund-based accounting and also the 85-15 rule. But beyond that, if there are any questions, we'll be happy to sort of take those questions now. Any questions? If there are any questions, be happy to see those. Um, okay. Don't think we have too many questions at the moment, but I think what I would definitely recommend a lot of the listeners for today is probably sign up with the Google form that the team has shared, in the comment section, and we'll be happy to sort of help you out on a one-on-one session because. With NGOs, there are a lot of intricate details that one needs to get into before any sort of guidance can be given, and we'd love to actually set these up, for you. Um, I think we've got one question. Where can we get the details of the donors to whom we can apply for the first time? The list, there are a lot of websites out there that are providing information on NGO funding and so on and so forth. At the moment we will not be able to share any particular website, because for us as well our understanding is based on multiple websites, but I suppose the team could get back to you with some sort of answer in a couple of days. um, I think there was another question about the CSR funding. Yes, if your NGO has been running for the last 5 years, you should be applying for a 12 AB or 80G. Unfortunately, the implementation or the effective date for the finance bill or the Finance Act was the 1st of June. But unfortunately, that has got postponed on account of COVID. The new date is now 1st of October. There could be delays even from 1st of October. We really don't know. But once it does become effective, you will have 3 months to then apply for a 12 AB and an ATG, fresh ATG registration and a fresh 12 AB registration as well. Um, if there are any other questions that we can address today. Oh yeah, I do want to mention though that even if if you already have a 12 AA and an 80G, then you will still get your tax exemptions for this year, even though you apply for a 12 AB, a fresh 12 AB and a fresh 80G under the new regulations. But if you don't have a prior 12 AA or an active 12 AA and 80G registration, then I suppose you probably won't get it. With a lot of these legalities, I think that there are loopholes in the implementation, and people tend to find their own loopholes. So we might get clarifications coming in the subsequent months, but this is our understanding as of now. I don't know if there are any more questions. I would I would say that we're possibly done for today. We really look forward to having these one-on-one sessions with you guys. And so please feel free to fill up that form, and our team will get in touch with you. We'll schedule a call. We'll take down the details, and then work to probably give you the most detailed and up-to-date advice that we can gather for you. Um, so I think as of now, you don't need to, obviously, you never need to register. I think we've just got one last question. You don't need to renew a 12AA effectively or a 12A, but with the new regulations, with the 12AB, you will need to renew these every 5 years. So you will get if you are already a running NGO with with more than 3 years of experience and so on and so forth, you will probably get a 5-year registration when you apply under the 12AB, and then after your 5 years get over, sorry, after 4.5 years, you will need to apply for a renewal of your 12AB registration. So as I was mentioning, I think we are done for today, and please fill up that form. Our team will get in touch with you, schedule a one-on-one session, and then try and give you as detailed advice as possible. So thanks for today. We really enjoyed, gathering information for today's session, and we really hope it was informative for you. And we look forward to seeing some of you, all of you, on the 19th of June, where we'll try and give you updates on fund-based accounting as well as the 85-15 rule as far as expenses go for NGOs. This would, of course, help with your tax exemptions and so on and so forth. So thanks for today.